The grinding despair of the Atlantic Gauntlet. The Battle of the Atlantic in 1942 was not a glorious clash of fleets. It was a slow, crushing attrition, fought in the merciless grey of the open sea. For the Allied air crews, the men of RAF Coastal Command and the desperate, newly formed anti-submarine squadrons of the U.S. Army Air Forces and Navy, the reality was a continuous, demoralizing encounter with an enemy they could barely touch. Their theatre of operations was the Bay of Biscay, the gateway to the Atlantic hunting grounds, and their primary emotion was frustration, quickly followed by a cold, numbing despair. We flew high. That was the doctrine etched into every briefing room, map, and every pilot's mind. We flew at altitudes measured in the hundreds, often the thousands, of feet, seeking the vast, panoramic view. We told ourselves that the extra altitude offered a tactical advantage: greater visibility, a broader sweep of the horizon, and time precious, vital time to maneuver the heavy bombers, the Liberators, and the Hudsons into a perfect attack vector. We believed that, from 1,000 feet, we could spot the fleeting black smudge of a surfaced U-boat, descend, and deliver our lethal payload. This belief was a fatal lie. The 60-second clock of doom. The German U-boat commanders, led by the ruthless Admiral Karl Dönitz, were masters of concealment and speed. Their vessels were engineered for one purpose: to strike from the darkness and vanish. The moment a lookout on a U-boat's conning tower caught the distant glint of an Allied wing, a warning that might come only seconds before the attack, the alarm sounded. The crew acted with practiced, desperate efficiency. Hatches slammed shut, air rushed into the ballast tanks, and the submarine began its emergency crash dive. That dive was the crucible of the entire operation. From the moment of sighting, the submarine needed only 60 seconds or less for an experienced crew to disappear completely beneath the surface. 60 seconds to transition from a vulnerable surface vessel to a phantom of the deep. This was the stopwatch that governed life and death in the Atlantic, and our high-altitude strategy guaranteed we always lost. Imagine the flight crew's experience. They spot the U-boat at 3 miles, a fleeting shadow on the waves. The pilot pushes the heavy yoke forward, initiating a steep, lung-straining dive. Every second is a hammer blow, the altimeter unwinding too slowly. Line up the shot, adjust for wind, maintain attack angle. By the time they have descended, by the moment the pilot's thumb presses the release, the U-boat is no longer where it was. It is 30, 40, 50 feet beneath the surface, descending rapidly. Our depth charges set to detonate at what were considered deep, effective levels. Typically 100 feet or more hit the water and followed a curved, horizontal trajectory. They arrived far too late, exploding hundreds of feet above the actual target. The shock waves were dissipated by the unforgiving mass of the ocean, merely shaking the U-boat's pressure hull instead of shattering it. The German crew below heard the dull, distant thud of the explosions, a sign of their incredible, repeated escape. They had won, simply by being faster than our descent. The mathematics of defeat. The cold, hard numbers returning to the intelligence desks in London and Washington told a story of impending defeat that dwarfed the individual acts of heroism. The statistical ratio was a grim, unsustainable calculus that hung like a pall over the entire campaign. In the first half of 1942, over the notorious transit routes of the Bay of Biscay, British RAF Coastal Command alone flew approximately 7,000 hours of anti-submarine patrols. The result? They suffered the catastrophic loss rate of 16 aircraft for every single U-boat actually sunk. 16 aircraft. 16 irreplaceable airframes, B-24, Liberators, Sunderlands, and Hudsons, reduced to wreckage. 16 crews, 10 men, each a total of 160 highly trained Allied lives, expended for the elimination of one U-boat and its crew of perhaps 50. This was not a sustainable exchange. It was a path to strategic suicide. The Germans were building U-boats faster than the Allies could sink them, and their construction yards were churning out hulls at a terrifying, accelerating pace. Admiral Dönitz, commanding nearly 400 operational submarines by the spring of 1943, was sinking Allied merchant ships at a rate that threatened to strangle Britain's supply lines entirely. The tonnage losses were astronomical, and the time gained by the high-altitude approach was precisely the time required for Britain to starve. Every pilot who returned to base knew this grim truth. They had faced the flak, dodged the weather, endured the grueling hours of monotony over the vast sea, and yet they were failing. The U-boats were escaping simply because they were allowed a 60-second head start. The pilots were brave, their equipment functional, but the tactics were a death sentence for the crews they protected, and ultimately for themselves. The Atlantic had become a gauntlet of despair, and the existing doctrine was the executioner. Something, anything, had to change, or the war would be lost beneath the waves. The necessity of a tactical revolution was not a matter of choice. It was a desperate, immediate military imperative. The suffocating gloom of 1,942, the relentless tally of losses, demanded a breaking point. The Strategic Command realized that relying on sheer firepower or more aircraft was futile. The failure was a matter of seconds and feet. The only way to beat the U-boat's 60-second dive was to eliminate those 60 seconds altogether. The ensuing tactical shift was not subtle. It was a brutal, technological awakening that instantly reversed the power dynamic in the Atlantic. The weapon of precision, the absolute altimeter. The linchpin of this revolution was a seemingly innocuous piece of equipment, the absolute altimeter. Developed in 1942 and standardized rapidly across the U.S. Army Air Force's anti-submarine fleet by early 1943, this device was the answer to the fatal imprecision of the past. Our pilots had been relying on barometric altimeters, instruments sensitive to air pressure, accurate enough for cruising, but tragically useless for judging the exact distance between wingtip and wavetop. The absolute altimeter changed the game. It used modified microwave radar, firing a precise beam down onto the ocean's surface and calculating the return time. This gave the pilot their exact altitude to within 10 feet, regardless of the darkness, the weather, or the churning of the waves. This was a weapon of precision. It removed the guesswork, the deadly visual estimation that had sent so many planes into the water or allowed so many U-boats to escape. With this device, a pilot possessed the nerve to fly low because they possessed the knowledge to survive flying low. They could know their height above the water at any moment, 30 feet, 20 feet, a realm of flight previously considered suicidal. The geometry of the kill, altitude versus warning time. The tactical implications of knowing your precise height were immediate and revolutionary. The key was the radar horizon. An aircraft patrolling at 1,000 feet could be spotted by a U-boat lookout or radar at a distance of up to 40 miles, giving the submarine crew agonizingly long minutes to prepare, crash dive, and escape. But an aircraft, already at 50 feet, the new standardized attack altitude, had its radar horizon radically truncated to less than 9 miles. The consequence was terrifying for the German submariner. No warning. The aircraft, hugging the wavetops, was hidden from the U-boat's radar and the lookout's visual line of sight until it was virtually upon them. The time between a U-boat spotting a plane and that plane entering the attack run was compressed from minutes to seconds. An aircraft already at 50 feet was not diving to attack position, it was already in attack position. It appeared over the horizon like a vengeful shadow, already closing the gap before the U-boat crew could even confirm the sighting, let alone tumble down the conning tower hatch. The shallow-set hammer, the Mark 9 depth charge. The second half of the equation was the lethal refinement of the weapon itself. In 1942, we set charges deep, assuming the U-boat would escape to 100 or 200 feet. The newly formed 1st Sea Search Attack Group at Langley Field, Virginia, developed a counter-logic. If we deny the submarine time to dive deep, we must set the charges shallow. The Mark 9 depth charge, packed with 200 pounds of the powerful Torpex explosive, was now fused for detonation at depths as minimal as 25 feet. Consider the physics of this devastating combination. The approach. The B-24 Liberator, guided by the absolute altimeter, skims the waves at 50 feet, accelerating toward the surfaced U-boat. The dive. The U-boat sounds the alarm and initiates a crash dive. In the first 60 seconds, it will only reach a depth of 30 to 40 feet, the most vulnerable transit phase. The drop. The aircraft, flying directly over the diving point, releases its stick of 4 charges from 50 feet. Dropped from this low altitude, the charges have almost no time to sink horizontally away from the impact point. They fall nearly straight down. The kill. As the U-boat struggles to gain depth, still descending toward the relative safety of 100 feet, the charges detonate at their preset depth of 25 feet, exploding right next to, or directly beneath, the hull. The U-boat's pressure hull, strong enough to withstand accumulated stress from distant explosions, was catastrophically vulnerable to an explosion detonating within 15 to 30 feet. The charges were no longer creating a shockwave. They were delivering a focused, pulverizing blow right where the submarine was weakest. The result was swift, clinical annihilation. Submarines that had survived hours of attack from surface escorts were now being cracked open like an egg by 4 or 5 shallow-set charges in a matter of seconds. The transformation, the Bay of Biscay as a killing ground. The adoption of this twin strategy, low-altitude flying via the absolute altimeter combined with shallow-set depth charges, transformed the operational environment almost overnight. The Bay of Biscay, once a dangerous transit zone, became known to the German crews as the Valley of Death. The offensive, spearheaded by Operation Dorange in April 1943, saw B-24 Liberators, equipped with the new technology, flying relentless coordinated patrols. The results were immediate and catastrophic for Donitz's force. The grim, unsustainable loss ratio of 1:6 was obliterated. German crews who survived, and there were few, reported a change that was psychological as much as physical. They were hit instantly, with no time to maneuver. They struggled to understand how the Allied aircraft were appearing with such little warning, suspecting some advanced, secret radar. The truth was simpler and infinitely more terrifying. The Allies were simply flying so low that they were invisible until it was too late. The tactical revolution was complete. We had exchanged safety for effectiveness. We asked our pilots to fly with a recklessness that bordered on the suicidal, skimming the wave crests where a single engine failure, a momentary lapse of concentration, or an unexpected gust of wind meant instant death. But this terrifying audacity was the price of victory. It was the only way to beat the U-boat's clock, to close the fatal time gap, and to transition the Battle of the Atlantic from a slow, grinding defeat into a decisive, shattering victory. The hunter had become the prey. The tactical revolution was not merely theoretical. Its success was instantly measurable in oil slicks and shattered U-boat hulls littering the floor of the Bay of Biscay. This body of water, which German U-boats were forced to traverse to reach their French bases from the Atlantic, had always been a dangerous commute. But with the deployment of the low-altitude doctrine, it instantaneously became what the German submariners grimly named the Valley of Death, the unforgiving stopwatch of annihilation. The core of the new system's effectiveness lay in its finality, the almost zero-sum exchange rate. The U-boat, designed for stealth and long-range hunting, was utterly exposed the moment it surfaced to charge batteries or transit at speed. The aircraft, flying at 50 feet, leveraged the element of surprise to the point of outright execution. Consider the narrative of Lieutenant Michael Esday at the beginning of this story. From visual contact to confirmed kill, 90 seconds elapsed. In this new game, the German crew was only granted the time it took for the aircraft to cross the few remaining miles, and for the bombs to sink 25 feet. There was no maneuvering, no evasive action, only the frantic, final rush to the diving controls. The aircraft would appear not as a distant threat that granted time for a tactical decision, but as a low, accelerating menace already positioned for the attack. The submarine lookouts, scanning the horizon for the high-flying planes of old, often didn't spot the B-24 Liberator or the B-17 Fortress until it was within 1 or 2 miles, a mere blink of an eye when closing at bomber speeds. The moment the depth charges hit the water, the U-boat, at its shallowest and weakest, was doomed. The resulting explosions, 4, sometimes 6, charges detonating at 25 feet, did not just damage the hull, they catastrophically fractured it. These were not the lucky hits that caused accumulated damage. These were immediate, lethal ruptures that sealed the boat's fate, sending it plummeting to the 3,000-foot depths of the bay. The numbers tell the story. May to July 1943. The statistics emerging from the Bay of Biscay in the summer of 1943 provide the most powerful evidence of the tactical shift. In the first half of 1942, as previously established, the record for U-boat kills by aircraft in this area was 0. 0 kills for thousands of patrol hours, and 16 aircraft lost for every theoretical sinking. The offensive, codenamed Operation Dorange, began in earnest in April 1943, utilizing 75 long-range aircraft equipped with the new absolute altimeters and centimetric radar. May 1000, 943. The initial shockwave hits the German fleet. 5 U-boats are sunk in the bay by aircraft, and another 7 are so severely damaged that they are forced to abort their critical patrols. June 1943. 4 more U-boats are destroyed, and 6 are severely crippled, unable to effectively hunt in the Atlantic. July 1943. The month of vindicated tactics. This month stands as the brutal testament to the low-altitude doctrine. RAF Coastal Command's No. 19 Group, operating from bases in southwestern England, sank a staggering 11 U-boats in the Bay of Biscay alone. 11 submarines destroyed in a single theatre of operations in 1 month. This single theatre accounted for 1/3 of all Allied U-boat kills worldwide during July. The hunters had become the hunted with devastating speed and efficiency. Case studies in annihilation. The descriptions of the attacks are uniform in their lethality, emphasizing the element of surprise. Flight Lieutenant Ramsden of RAF 220 Squadron, flying a B-17 Fortress, demonstrated the method perfectly. Flying at a scant 50 feet through a gap in the clouds, he spotted U-265 on the surface. Positioning his aircraft to attack with the sun at his back, a classic, low-level fighter tactic now used by bombers, he dropped his 7 depth charges. The submarine was shattered instantly, going down with all 46 crew members. Total time from visual sighting to confirmed destruction, less than 2 minutes. 4 days later, another 220 Squadron Fortress caught U-624, while the submarine was dangerously focused on transmitting a lengthy radio report. The crew never saw the attacker until the splash of the depth charges. U-624 went down with all hands. The message was clear. Surfacing was death. Hesitation was death. The U-boats were not being hunted. They were being executed on sight. Each destroyed vessel represented an investment of millions of Reichsmarks, a crew of 40 to 50 highly trained specialists, and the potential to sink tens of thousands of tons of Allied shipping. All removed from the war in the space of a minute and a half. The crushing psychological impact. Beyond the physical destruction of the U-boat fleet, the new tactics inflicted a terrible psychological toll. German submariners had always faced grim odds, but they had relied on the ability to escape, to dive deep, and endure the explosions. Now, their primary defense was rendered useless. U-boat crews who survived the Bay of Biscay transit reported a state of constant, debilitating terror. They knew that surfacing, even to charge batteries, was a high-risk gamble. They knew that the enemy aircraft they could not see were flying in the blind spots, perpetually waiting at wave-top level. The diary of Korvettenkapitän Hans Ludwig Witt, commander of U-159, recovered years later, provides a horrifying glimpse into this reality. July 17th. Another aircraft attack. This one came from nowhere. Lookouts saw nothing until bombs were already falling. How are they finding us? How are they getting so close? July 24th. Final entry. Aircraft everywhere. Cannot stay surfaced for more than minutes at a time. Battery nearly depleted. Must surface to charge. God help us. U-159 was sunk that afternoon by a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina flying at 75 feet. The entire crew was lost. This was the brutal reality of the Valley of Death. The combination of low-altitude surprise and the lethal precision of shallow-set charges had achieved what all previous tactics could not. It had fundamentally broken the U-boat's invulnerability, transforming the Atlantic War from a drawn-out struggle into a relentless, one-sided slaughter. The statistics had reversed, and the Allies were finally gaining the upper hand in the crucial battle for the sea lines of communication. The catastrophic statistics pouring out of the Bay of Biscay throughout May, June, and July of 1943 could not be hidden, even within the insulated walls of the German High Command. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect and commander of the U-boat fleet, was a formidable adversary, but even he could not rationalize away the sheer speed and totality of his losses. The reports from the few surviving U-boats were unanimous. The Allied aircraft were appearing without warning and killing instantly. The fundamental tactical calculus of the war at sea had been overturned, and the German response was one of desperate, almost suicidal, adaptation. The failure of the flakboats and group tactics. Dönitz's initial reaction was to fight back against the unseen menace. Recognizing that the U-boats were only vulnerable when on the surface the time required for transit and battery charging, he ordered a radical, counterintuitive shift: group transit and surface engagement. The new directive mandated that U-boats should cross the Bay of Biscay in tight formations, guns manned, prepared to fight as flak boats, anti-aircraft boats, rather than dive and hide. The theory was sound. Mutual anti-aircraft fire would, in combination, be sufficient to drive off the low-flying attackers. It was a measure of absolute desperation. U-boats were meticulously designed to be submerged predators, not unstable surface gun platforms. Their armament, typically a single 20mm cannon and a few machine guns, was woefully inadequate against the speed and maneuverability of an attacking B-24 Liberator or a Beaufighter. The first attempts were bloody failures. Flight Sergeant Anderson, flying a Liberator, encountered one of the first U-boat formations, 3 submarines in a tight V, their guns blazing. The concentrated fire ripped into his aircraft, hitting it repeatedly and severely. Yet, Anderson held his course, coming in low and fast, releasing his stick of depth charges over the lead boat. His damaged Liberator barely limped back to base, but one of the 3 U-boats did not make it home at all. The concentrated fire had failed to deter the audacious, low-flying attack. The experiment was pushed further with specially modified U-boats, such as U-441, equipped with powerful quad 20mm cannons and a 37mm semi-automatic gun. Yet, when U-441 encountered 3 RAF Beaufighters, the result was a ferocious but ultimately tactical defeat. The submarine was a rocking, unstable gun carriage against fast-moving, multi-directional aircraft. U-441 managed to hit the attackers multiple times, but could not prevent the sustained assault. It escaped only after suffering 10 dead and 13 wounded. Dönitz, whose loyalty to the submarine arm was absolute, was forced to confront the impossible truth, writing candidly in his diary, "The submarine is not an ideal anti-aircraft weapon." The flakboat program, a brilliant gamble born of necessity, was quietly but definitively abandoned. The decisive strategic reversal: the battle is lost. The failure of the flakboats coincided with the true strategic turning point, a battle fought far to the north but won by the exact same low-altitude tactics, the destruction of the U-boat force operating against the Allied convoys. The pivotal moment arrived in May 1943. Convoy ONS-5, attacked by a wolf pack of 30 U-boats, should have been a slaughter of merchant ships. Instead, due to the arrival of long-range B-24 Liberators, operating out of Newfoundland, now equipped with the absolute altimeter and shallow-set charges, it became a massacre of the submarines. 6 U-boats were sunk by air and surface escorts. The attack was repulsed. 2 weeks later, Convoy SC-130 destroyed at least 3 more U-boats for 0 merchant ship losses. The equation had irreversibly reversed. The climax came on May 24, 1943, a date that should be etched in the history of naval warfare. Dönitz, faced with the overwhelming, inescapable data, made the most significant admission of the war. We had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. The numbers were staggering. 43 U-boats destroyed in May 1943 alone. This represented a catastrophic 25% of the entire operational U-boat fleet wiped out in a single, devastating month. While the Allies tragically lost 58 merchant ships in the same period, the strategic balance had tilted irrevocably. Germany was losing submarines faster than they could train crews and deploy new hulls. The hunters had unequivocally become the hunted. Retreat and paralysis. The U-boat fleet is muzzled. Faced with an existential threat and the failure of surface engagement, Dönitz had only one viable, yet equally crippling, option: concealment and evasion. By August 1943, Dönitz was forced to issue a desperate, service-wide order: all U-boats must transit the Bay of Biscay submerged, day and night. They were only permitted to surface to charge batteries when absolutely necessary, and then only for the minimum required time, preferably under the cover of the darkest night. This was a victory for the Allies more profound than any single sinking. The U-boat, forced underwater, was slow, blind, and consumed its limited battery power. Boats that should have been speeding toward the prime hunting grounds of the North Atlantic were instead crawling through the Bay of Biscay at minimal speed, perpetually tense, trying not to be detected. The operational efficiency of the entire fleet was drastically reduced. The U-boats were still sailing, but they were effectively muzzled, spending their precious operational time hiding instead of hunting. The psychological warfare aspect was just as damaging. German crews knew they were running the gauntlet. The knowledge that surfacing the very necessity of their survival might mean instant, unseen death created a constant, demoralizing state of tension. The morale reports from U-boat command became grim reading. Men requested transfers to surface ships. Others exhibited clear symptoms of combat fatigue. The low-altitude tactics, a simple yet brutal innovation, had achieved the impossible. They had closed the critical mid-Atlantic air gap, rendered the U-boat's primary defense useless, shattered the German command's confidence, and fundamentally neutralized the strategic threat posed by the submarine fleet. The U-boat arm had been strategically crippled, effectively ending the most crucial battle of the war for Allied survival. The tactical victory was absolute, but its cost was etched not just in sunk tonnage and shattered hulls, but in the final, horrific human toll. The Battle of the Atlantic, won in the skies above the wave-tops of the Bay of Biscay, stands as one of the most brutal and absolute conflicts of World War II. It was a fight defined by the willingness of men on both sides to push beyond the limits of sanity and safety. The unimaginable German sacrifice. For the German submariners, the Bay of Biscay, in 1943, became a graveyard of steel and flesh. The statistics are horrifyingly clear. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in the German U-boat arm during World War II, nearly 30,000, a devastating 75%, died in action. This casualty rate was the highest of any branch in the German military, surpassing even the brutal fronts of the Eastern Bloc and the fanatical Japanese forces. These men died not in the glory of battle, but in steel tubes at the bottom of the ocean, victims of an enemy they often never saw. When a shallow-set depth charge detonated within 15 feet of the hull, the destruction was instantaneous. The pressure hull ruptured, water flooded in with the force of an explosion, and the boat lost trim, plummeting thousands of feet into the darkness and crushing pressure. There were typically no survivors. The U-boat simply disappeared, leaving behind only an oil slick, a few pieces of debris, and the chilling radio silence that informed Donitz that another crew had been claimed by the Valley of Death. The psychological weight on the crews was immense. To surface was to risk instant execution. To remain submerged meant slowly suffocating the boat's battery life and jeopardizing the mission. They were caught in an impossible, terrifying dilemma, a constant, debilitating tension that wore them down before they even reached the hunting grounds. The U-boat service, once the elite of the German Navy, had become a desperate, doomed posting. The Allied sacrifice, trading altitude for effectiveness. The victory was not achieved without Allied blood. The low-altitude campaign demanded a terrifying new definition of courage. Flying at 50 feet over the vast, cold Atlantic required a continuous, hyper-vigilant intensity that strained crews to the breaking point. There was no margin for error. A momentary lapse of attention, an unexpected wind shear, a sudden malfunction, any of these could send the heavy bomber tumbling into the water. The aircraft that survived the flight risked the enemy's fire. The low altitude that provided the tactical advantage also robbed the pilots of any space to maneuver when the German guns opened up. They became easy targets for the U-boat's flak, a sacrifice demanded by the imperative to sink the submarine. The losses were substantial. U.S. Army Air Force's anti-submarine squadrons lost 12 planes and 102 men to enemy action and accidents during their campaign in the theater. Navy patrol bomber losses amounted to 16 aircraft and 157 crewmen. These were high costs for the relatively small number of squadrons involved. However, the cost must be measured against the strategic gain. The 13 U-boats credited to the American air efforts alone represented hundreds of thousands of tons of merchant shipping capacity saved and thousands of Allied lives protected. The pilots who flew at 50 feet made a conscious, terrifying trade. They exchanged their own safety, their altitude, and their time to react for the exponentially increased effectiveness of their attack. As Flight Lieutenant Esday, the pilot who opened this story, reflected, "We knew what we were doing was working. So we kept flying low, kept attacking, kept hunting them, because that's what won the war." This sustained, terrifying audacity was the heart of the Allied victory. The enduring legacy of the 50-foot attack. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the U-boat threat was neutered. The final chapter of the Battle of the Atlantic was written by the low-altitude air campaign, which forced the U-boat fleet into a non-factor. The legacy of these tactics extends far beyond the final surrender. The core principle established by those pilots at Langley Field and Coastal Command remains the dominant doctrine in modern anti-submarine warfare, ASW, the need to close the attack gap instantly. While today's threats are faster, deeper, and more sophisticated, the operational mantra is unchanged. Modern maritime patrol aircraft and ASW helicopters still use the low-altitude, high-speed approach to deny the submarine any time to maneuver or escape. Helicopters, hovering at 100 feet or less, deploy sonobuoys and torpedoes, using the same principle: get close, attack fast, and deliver the payload where the submarine is most vulnerable. The pilots of the B, 24 seconds, the Fortresses, and the Catalinas were called many things by the Germans reckless, crude cowboys. But they understood a fundamental truth of asymmetrical warfare. The best weapon is often the one used in the most unconventional, terrifying way. Their refusal to adhere to the safe altitude, their willingness to treat the ocean's surface as a runway was not mere recklessness. It was a brutal, calculated strategy. They flew low to win. They flew low to ensure that the depth charges, set for 25 feet, would fall true. They flew low until the enemy was broken, their morale shattered, and their mighty fleet scattered across the bottom of the Bay of Biscay. The story of the low-altitude attack is the story of profound courage, married to tactical necessity, a testament to the few men who flew inches above the waves to win the longest, most terrifying battle of the war. The legacy of the low-altitude anti-submarine campaign is not found in grand parades or celebrated treaties. It is etched into the final, defining statistics of the Battle of the Atlantic. The shift from flying at a safe 1,000 feet to a suicidal 50 feet was the single, most decisive tactical adaptation of the war at sea. It was a choice rooted not in reckless abandon, but in the cold, hard necessity of survival. The consequence was immediate and total. Before 1943, we faced an unsustainable defeat. After, the German U-boat arm collapsed. May 1943, the month of the Great Reversal, marked the moment the hunters became the hunted. Their primary defense, the crash dive, rendered useless by the combined power of the absolute altimeter and the shallow-set depth charge. The Bay of Biscay became a crucible, a terrifying gauntlet where the rules of engagement were simple. If you surfaced, you died. This victory was secured not by technological miracles, but by the sheer, grinding courage of the aircrews. They flew missions where the margin for error was measured in inches, where the backwash from their propellers left visible tracks on the water. They willingly traded their own safety for lethality, knowing that a successful kill meant saving the lives of hundreds of merchant seamen in the convoys. Their success was so absolute that it fundamentally altered German strategy. The U-boat fleet was forced into a state of paralysis, crawling, submerged, and ineffective, ultimately neutralizing the strategic threat to the Allied supply lines. The very essence of the U-boat stealth and speed was defeated by an enemy that flew lower than their periscope depth. When the war ended, the final, brutal statistic spoke for itself: a 75% casualty rate for the U-boat service. Those men, trapped in steel coffins by charges they never heard coming, were the final, tragic cost of a tactical arrogance that refused to adapt. The men who flew at 50 feet rarely spoke of the terror, only of the work. They were the silent architects of victory, ensuring that the lifeline of the Atlantic remained open. Their legacy endures today, confirming a timeless military principle. In the face of an existential threat, sometimes the simplest, most dangerous action is the only one that can turn the tide. They flew low enough to win, and in doing so, they secured the survival of a continent.